Picture this. A man walks into a federal courtroom, takes the stand under immunity, and proceeds to confess to multiple shootings, admits to lying to police for years, and essentially destroys the prosecution's case against one of hip-hop's biggest stars. That man was Kenneth Copeland, better known as Lil Woody. But here's the twist. By helping Young Thug walk free, Woody may have just painted the biggest target on his back that the federal government has ever aimed at a witness. See, when you're granted immunity, you're supposed to tell the truth. But what happens when your truth includes admitting to crimes that weren't part of the original deal? What happens when the feds realize they've been played by their own star witness? And what happens when that witness becomes more famous for trolling prosecutors than actually helping them? Today, we're diving deep into the wild story of how a street dude from Atlanta went from Young Thug's alleged shooter to the prosecution's worst nightmare, and why the federal government might be planning their revenge. Stick around until the end, because what I'm about to reveal about Woody's current situation will shock you. The game ain't over, it's just getting started. Kenneth Copeland entered this world in 1991 as the seventh child in a family of 10 kids, born into the unforgiving streets of Atlanta's Zone 1. His early years were spent in the infamous Bowen Homes projects in Bankhead, the same concrete maze that produced legendary Atlanta figures like Shawty Lo. These weren't just apartment buildings, they were breeding grounds for the type of street politics that would shape Woody's entire worldview. Bowen Homes was more than just public housing. It was a microcosm of urban survival where children learned the rules of the street before they could properly read. The projects were notorious for their violence, drug activity, and the code of silence that governed daily life. For young Kenneth, this environment normalized violence and taught him that respect was earned through fear, and that loyalty was the most valuable currency. The Bankhead neighborhood itself was a war zone during Woody's formative years. This was the era when Atlanta's crack epidemic was at its peak, and territorial disputes between different crews were settled with bullets rather than words. Children growing up in this environment didn't have the luxury of innocence. They were forced to mature quickly or become victims of their circumstances. But Woody's childhood was marked by tragedy from the jump. When he was just 10 years old, his father passed away from cancer, leaving his mother to raise 10 children on government assistance. The loss of the family's primary breadwinner wasn't just an emotional blow, it was an economic catastrophe that would force the family to make desperate choices to survive. The family was forced to relocate to Mechanicsville near downtown Atlanta, where they survived on food stamps and whatever hustle his mother could manage. According to Woody himself, their home doubled as a trap house, not the glamorous kind you see in music videos, but the desperate kind where survival trumps everything else. This wasn't a choice made out of greed, but out of necessity, as a single mother tried to feed 10 children in a system that seemed designed to keep them in poverty. But perhaps the most defining moment of Woody's early life wasn't the poverty or the loss of his father. It was a childhood accident that would alter his brain chemistry forever. As a young kid, Woody rode a big wheel down a flight of stairs, crashing headfirst and suffering a severe traumatic brain injury. The damage was extensive. He lost his memory, his speech, and his hearing. This wasn't just a bump on the head. This was life-altering trauma that forced him into special education classes and even required him to learn sign language in case he went completely deaf. The injury affected his cognitive development in ways that wouldn't be fully understood until years later, when federal investigators conducted a psychological evaluation during his cooperation period. The brain injury created a perfect storm of circumstances that would influence every major decision Woody would make for the rest of his life. The damage to his frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and decision-making, meant that Woody would struggle with consequences and long-term thinking throughout his adolescence and into adulthood. Medical experts who later examined Woody's case noted that traumatic brain injuries in children often lead to increased aggression, poor impulse control, and difficulty understanding social cues. These symptoms would manifest in Woody's later behavior, contributing to his reputation for violence and his inability to navigate complex social situations without resorting to aggression. The educational system failed Woody completely. Instead of receiving the specialized care and therapy he needed to recover from his brain injury, he was simply placed in special education classes with minimal support. His teachers didn't understand the extent of his cognitive damage, and his family lacked the resources to seek private treatment. This educational neglect would have lasting consequences, leaving Woody functionally illiterate and unable to pursue legitimate career opportunities. When Woody was 17, tragedy struck again. His mother passed away, leaving him completely orphaned and without any real parental guidance. This was the moment when the streets officially became his family. He dropped out of high school, or rather, brother, got kicked out after a fight and never looked back. The education system had failed him, his family structure had collapsed, and the only thing left was the code of the streets. The death of his mother wasn't just the loss of a parent, it was the severing of his last connection to legitimate society. His mother had been the only person who could control his behavior, the only authority figure he respected. Without her influence, Woody was completely adrift, with no moral compass except the brutal logic of street survival. During this period, Woody began running with a crew known as the DRC, the Robin Crew, named after their neighborhood. This wasn't some casual friendship group, this was a tight-knit organization involved in everything from theft to armed robbery. The crew provided Woody with the family structure he had lost, but it was a family bound together by violence and criminal activity rather than love and support. Woody's reputation during this time was that of someone who would do whatever it took to survive, and his willingness to use violence made him a valuable asset to anyone looking for muscle. His brain injury, rather than being a disability, became an asset in this environment. His lack of impulse control and inability to fully understand consequences made him fearless in situations where others might hesitate. The Robin Crew operated in a specific territory within Atlanta, and they had ongoing conflicts with rival crews over drug corners, respect, and perceived slights. Woody quickly established himself as someone who could be counted on when violence was necessary. His reputation for being crazy, which was really just the manifestation of his brain injury, made him a valuable enforcer. Woody's criminal career began with small-time theft and gradually escalated to more serious offenses. His first arrest came at age 17 for carrying a concealed weapon, a charge he allegedly took for a friend who was being pursued by police. This act of loyalty, while misguided, established a pattern that would define Woody's relationship with authority for years to come. The gun charge was significant because it introduced Woody to the criminal justice system at a crucial time in his development. Instead of receiving the mental health treatment and educational support he desperately needed, he was processed through a system designed for punishment rather than rehabilitation. This early experience with incarceration taught him that the system was his enemy and that cooperation with authority was a sign of weakness. Over the next few years, Woody would be arrested multiple times for various charges, including theft, battery, obstruction, aggravated assault, participation in a criminal street gang, and making terroristic threats. Each arrest reinforced his alienation from legitimate society and pushed him deeper into the criminal underworld. The pattern of his arrests reveals a young man spiraling out of control, with each offense becoming more serious than the last. What started as petty theft evolved into armed robbery, and what began as simple assault escalated to aggravated assault with deadly weapons. This escalation wasn't unusual for someone with Woody's background and brain injury, but it set him on a collision course with more serious legal consequences. In 2013, Woody's best friend DB was killed in a drive-by shooting. This wasn't just the loss of a friend. This was the moment that transformed Woody from a street hustler into something much more dangerous. In his own words, after DB's death, he had to go terrorize, and he meant exactly what that sounds like. DB wasn't just Woody's friend, he was his brother in every sense except blood. They had grown up together in the same neighborhood, survived the same hardships, and built their reputations together in the streets. DB's death represented the loss of the last person who truly understood Woody's pain and shared his experiences. The grief and rage from losing his closest friend pushed Woody over the edge. He began moving differently in the streets, with a reputation for violence that preceded him wherever he went. This was the period when Woody truly earned his stripes as someone not to be messed with. The streets of Atlanta began to take notice of this young man who seemed to have no fear and nothing left to lose. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was complete. Where Woody had previously been willing to use violence when necessary, he now actively sought out confrontation. He began carrying weapons regularly and developed a hair-trigger temper that made him dangerous to be around. Friends and associates noticed the change and began treating him with a mixture of respect and fear. DB's murder was never solved, which added to Woody's rage and sense of injustice. In the street code, when someone kills your friend and gets away with it, you're expected to handle the situation yourself. The fact that the police couldn't or wouldn't solve the case reinforced Woody's belief that he lived in a world where justice came from the barrel of a gun. Following DB's death, Woody began actively building a reputation as someone not to be crossed. He started involving himself in conflicts that didn't directly concern him, always ready to escalate situations to violence. This behavior wasn't just about revenge. It was about establishing himself as a force to be reckoned with in Atlanta's street hierarchy. The streets of Atlanta operate on a complex system of respect and fear, where reputation is everything and weakness is punished swiftly. Woody understood this system intuitively, and he began systematically building his reputation through a series of increasingly violent encounters. Each successful confrontation added to his legend and made him more valuable to those who needed muscle. Word began to spread throughout Atlanta's underground about this young man who seemed to have no regard for his own safety and no hesitation about using extreme violence. This reputation made him both feared and sought after by various criminal organizations who needed someone willing to handle their most dangerous problems. Woody's willingness to crash out, to risk everything in violent confrontations, made him particularly valuable in a city where most criminals were trying to avoid attention from law enforcement. While others were becoming more cautious as police pressure increased, Woody was becoming more reckless and more dangerous. It was during this dark period of Woody's life that he caught the attention of Jeffrey Williams, better known as Young Thug. Thug was on the rise in 2013 to 2014 with hits like Stoner and Danny Glover putting him on the map nationally. But success in the rap game, especially in Atlanta, often comes with street politics, and Thug needed people around him who could handle business when words weren't enough. Young Thug's rise to fame wasn't happening in a vacuum. Atlanta's hip-hop scene was incredibly competitive, with multiple artists and crews vying for the same opportunities and respect. Success often bred jealousy and conflict, and artists needed protection from both street rivals and industry competitors who might try to sabotage their careers. According to Woody's testimony, Thug called him out of the blue one day and said, "Hey, come see me. You want to go on shows with me?" This wasn't just an invitation to hang out. This was Thug recruiting Woody for a specific purpose. Thug had heard about Woody's reputation, his willingness to handle problems, and his loyalty to those who showed him respect. The timing of this recruitment was crucial. Thug was at a point in his career where he was successful enough to attract enemies, but not yet established enough to have institutional protection. He needed street credibility and muscle to navigate the dangerous waters of Atlanta's hip-hop scene, and Woody provided both. For Woody, the invitation represented an opportunity to align himself with someone who was clearly destined for success. After years of struggling in the streets with little to show for it, the chance to be part of something bigger was incredibly appealing. It offered him a path to legitimacy and financial success that had previously seemed impossible. Woody's time in Thug's circle was relatively short, roughly from late 2014 to mid-2015, but it was intense. He became what you might call an enforcer, someone who handled situations that required a more direct approach. This role even earned him a mention in Young Thug's hit song Halftime, where Thug rapped about how if anyone messed with him, Woody would come up and pop you in the noggin. The enforcer role in hip-hop circles is both prestigious and dangerous. It means you're trusted with the artist's safety and reputation, but it also means you're expected to handle problems that could result in serious legal consequences. For someone like Woody, who had already established himself as willing to use violence, this role was a natural fit. But here's where things get complicated. While that song was recorded in 2014 when everything was good between them, it wasn't released until April 2015. Right in the middle of a violent street war that would change everything. By the time fans were hearing Thug rap about Woody being a shooter, Woody was already in a very different place mentally and legally. The public nature of this acknowledgement was significant in street culture. When a successful artist publicly claims someone as their shooter, it elevates that person's status but also makes them a target for rivals. Woody's reputation was now tied to Young Thug's success, which brought both opportunities and dangers. The enforcer role also came with certain expectations about loyalty and discretion. Woody was expected to handle problems without involving Thug directly and to never discuss their business with outsiders. This code of silence would later become a source of conflict when Woody felt that his loyalty wasn't being reciprocated. In the streets, loyalty is supposed to be a two-way street. When someone puts their life on the line for you, there's an unspoken understanding that you'll take care of them and their family if something happens. Woody believed he had this type of relationship with Young Thug. He was willing to crash out to risk everything because he thought Thug would have his back. This unspoken contract is fundamental to street culture and criminal organizations. It's based on the understanding that everyone involved is taking risks, and those who take the biggest risks deserve the greatest protection and compensation. Woody believed that his willingness to handle violent situations for Thug entitled him to certain protections and considerations. The relationship between an artist and their street muscle is complex and often poorly defined. Unlike legitimate business relationships, there are no contracts or formal agreements. Everything is based on trust and mutual understanding. This ambiguity often leads to misunderstandings and feelings of betrayal when expectations aren't met. But according to Woody's later statements to police, this support never materialized the way he expected. When Woody found himself in legal trouble, when his family was being threatened, when he needed that loyalty reciprocated, he felt abandoned. This sense of betrayal would become a crucial factor in his later decision to cooperate with law enforcement. The feeling of abandonment was particularly acute because Woody had sacrificed so much for what he believed was a mutually beneficial relationship. He had put his freedom, his safety, and his reputation on the line, and when he needed support in return, he felt that Thug had turned his back on him. One of the sources of tension between Woody and young Thug was financial compensation. While Woody was risking his freedom and safety as an enforcer, he wasn't seeing the financial benefits he expected from Thug's growing success. This disparity created resentment and contributed to Woody's eventual decision to distance himself from the organization. In the street world, financial compensation for muscle is often irregular and based on the success of the operation. Unlike legitimate employment, there are no guaranteed salaries or benefits. This uncertainty can create tension, especially when the person providing protection sees the artist becoming wealthy while they remain financially insecure. Woody later revealed in interviews that he had to tell women he was dating that Thug was the one with money, not him. This admission reveals the gap between Woody's reputation and his actual financial situation. Despite being associated with a successful artist, he was still struggling financially and living paycheck to paycheck. The financial disparity was particularly frustrating because Woody was taking the greatest legal risks. While Thug could maintain plausible deniability about violent incidents, Woody was the one who would face serious criminal charges if caught. This imbalance in risk versus reward contributed to his growing resentment. One of the most significant events that set everything in motion was an incident involving a chain belonging to Donovan Big Nut Thomas, a high-ranking member of the Inglewood family Bloods, and the man behind the careers of Rich Homie Quan and YFN Lucci. According to various accounts, Woody allegedly took this chain during a confrontation, an act that would have serious consequences in the street politics of Atlanta. Taking someone's chain isn't just theft in the hip-hop world. It's a sign of ultimate disrespect. It's saying that you don't just want their property, you want to humiliate them publicly. For someone like Big Nut, who had a reputation to maintain and soldiers who looked up to him, this couldn't go unanswered. The chain incident allegedly occurred during a confrontation at a nightclub where tensions between different crews had been building for months. According to witness accounts, there was a physical altercation, and during the chaos, Woody allegedly took Big Nut's chain. This act was seen as a declaration of war in the street world. The significance of the chain went beyond its monetary value. In hip-hop culture, jewelry represents success, status, and respect. Taking someone's chain is equivalent to taking their reputation and their standing in the community. It's an act that demands retaliation or the victim loses all credibility. Big Nut's chain was particularly significant because it represented his status as a leader in the Inglewood family Bloods and his success in the music industry. Losing it to someone from a rival organization was not just a personal humiliation, but a blow to his entire crew's reputation. Realizing the gravity of what had happened, there were allegedly attempts to make things right. In the street world, sometimes conflicts can be resolved through mediation, compensation, or public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But by this point, too much had happened, too many people were involved, and the situation had escalated beyond the point of peaceful resolution. The attempted mediation involved respected figures from both sides trying to find a solution that would allow everyone to save face. These negotiations are common in street conflicts, as all-out war is expensive and dangerous for everyone involved. However, the chain incident had created too much public humiliation for Big Nut to simply accept an apology. According to sources familiar with the situation, there were discussions about financial compensation and public acknowledgement of the disrespect. However, these negotiations broke down when it became clear that neither side was willing to make the concessions necessary for peace. The failure to resolve this conflict peacefully set the stage for a war between YSL and YFN that would result in multiple deaths and ultimately lead to one of the largest RICO cases in Georgia history. What started as a personal dispute between individuals escalated into an organizational conflict that would consume both crews. The breakdown in negotiations also highlighted the limitations of street justice. While the code of the streets provides a framework for resolving conflicts, it often leads to escalation rather than resolution, especially when pride and reputation are at stake. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the complex relationship between YSL, Young Stoner Life, and YFN, Young Fly Angus. These weren't just record labels. They were street organizations with real territorial disputes and genuine animosity. The beef allegedly started over business disputes between Young Thug and Rich Homie Quan, but it quickly escalated into something much more serious. The relationship between YSL and YFN had been complicated from the beginning. Both organizations operated in the same city, targeted the same demographics, and competed for the same resources. While they had collaborated musically in the past, underlying tensions had always existed beneath the surface. Rich Homie Quan was managed by Big Nut, who was also a high-ranking member of the Inglewood family Bloods. When tensions arose between Thug and Quan over signing deals and territorial disputes, it wasn't just a business disagreement. It was a conflict between two powerful street organizations with the resources and willingness to go to war. The business dispute centered around Young Thug's desire to sign Rich Homie Quan to his label. When Quan refused and chose to remain independent under Big Nut's management, it created a rift that went beyond simple business competition. In the street world, rejection is often seen as disrespect, and disrespect demands a response. The territorial aspect of the conflict was equally important. Both organizations claimed influence over certain areas of Atlanta, and their members often found themselves in competition for drug corners, respect, and resources. These territorial disputes created multiple flashpoints where violence could erupt. What started as business disputes quickly escalated into a series of violent encounters throughout Atlanta. According to court documents and witness testimony, there were dozens of shootings, drive-bys, and retaliatory attacks between members and associates of both groups. This wasn't random violence. This was organized, systematic warfare being conducted in the streets of one of America's major cities. The escalation followed a predictable pattern common to street wars. Each act of violence demanded retaliation, which in turn demanded counter-retaliation. What might have started as a simple dispute quickly spiraled into a cycle of violence that took on a life of its own. The violence wasn't limited to the primary participants. Associates, friends, and even family members of both organizations became targets. This expansion of the conflict created a climate of fear throughout Atlanta's hip-hop community, as artists and industry figures worried about being caught in the crossfire. The weapons used in these conflicts were increasingly sophisticated and deadly. What might have started with handguns quickly escalated to assault rifles and other military-style weapons. The level of firepower being deployed suggested that both sides were preparing for all-out war rather than simple street disputes. Law enforcement was aware of the escalating violence but struggled to intervene effectively. The code of silence that governed street culture made it difficult to gather evidence, and witnesses were reluctant to cooperate with police for fear of retaliation. By January 2015, the situation had reached a boiling point. There had been multiple confrontations, including the incident at Club Crucial where Woody allegedly had a physical altercation with Shell Kelvin Watts, Big Nut's brother. This wasn't just a bar fight, this was a public challenge that demanded a response in the street world. The confrontation at Club Crucial was significant because it happened in public, in front of witnesses, and involved disrespect that couldn't be ignored. In the street code, when someone challenges you publicly, you have to respond or risk losing all credibility. This incident set the stage for what would happen next. According to witness accounts, the confrontation began when Shell Kell approached Woody about the chain incident. Words were exchanged and the situation quickly escalated to physical violence. While no shots were fired at the club, the public nature of the confrontation made retaliation inevitable. The incident also demonstrated how personal the conflict had become. This wasn't just about business or territory anymore. It was about personal honor and family loyalty. Shell Kell was defending his brother's reputation, while Woody was defending his own standing in the street hierarchy. The failure to resolve this confrontation peacefully marked the point of no return for both organizations. After this incident, violence became inevitable and both sides began preparing for war. Following the Club Crucial incident, both YSL and YFN began preparing for serious conflict. This preparation involved acquiring weapons, recruiting additional muscle, and developing strategies for attacking their enemies while protecting themselves. The preparation phase revealed the organizational structure of both groups. Rather than being loose associations of friends, both YSL and YFN operated with military-like discipline and hierarchy. Orders came from the top and soldiers were expected to follow them without question. Intelligence gathering became crucial during this phase. Both sides began monitoring their enemies' movements, identifying targets, and planning attacks. This surveillance created a climate of paranoia where everyone involved had to constantly watch their backs. The preparation also involved securing safe houses, establishing communication protocols, and developing escape routes. Both organizations understood that the coming conflict would attract law enforcement attention, and they needed to be prepared for that eventuality. On the night of January 10, 2015, Donovan "Big Nut" Thomas was at a barbershop in Atlanta when a car pulled up and opened fire. Big Nut was killed instantly, and 2 other people, including a 14-year-old, were wounded in the shooting. This wasn't just another street killing. This was the assassination of one of the most powerful figures in Atlanta's underground scene. The barbershop where Big Nut was killed was in a neighborhood he considered safe territory. The fact that his enemies were willing to attack him there demonstrated both their boldness and their determination to end the conflict decisively. The choice of location also sent a message that nowhere was safe for their enemies. According to witness testimony and police reports, as Big Nut lay dying, he told his brother that "Thug had me killed." These would be his final words, and they would become a crucial piece of evidence in the prosecution's case against Young Thug years later. The dying declaration carried special weight in the legal system and would haunt Young Thug throughout his trial. The shooting itself was professionally executed, suggesting that this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully planned assassination. The shooters knew Big Nut's routine, his location, and the best time to strike. This level of planning indicated that the attack had been in development for some time. The choice to kill Big Nut rather than simply injuring him or sending a warning demonstrated the seriousness of the conflict. In the street world, assassination is reserved for the most serious disputes, and it typically leads to all-out war rather than resolution. Within hours of Big Nut's murder, retaliation began. Woody's girlfriend's mother's house was shot up the same night. His brother's house was also targeted, though the shooters initially hit the wrong house before coming back to shoot up the correct one. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic retaliation designed to send a message. The speed and coordination of these retaliatory attacks suggested that this wasn't a spontaneous response, but rather a planned operation. Multiple locations were hit almost simultaneously, indicating a level of organization and resources that went beyond typical street beef. The targeting of family members represented an escalation in the conflict. While street wars typically focus on the primary participants, the decision to target Woody's family members demonstrated that this conflict had moved beyond traditional boundaries. This escalation created fear throughout the community and made it clear that no one connected to the conflict was safe. The fact that the shooters initially hit the wrong house before correcting their mistake showed both the determination of the attackers and the danger faced by innocent people in the neighborhood. This type of collateral damage is common in street wars and often leads to increased law enforcement pressure. The systematic nature of the retaliation also suggested that Big Nut's organization had prepared for his potential death and had plans in place for immediate response. This level of preparation indicated that both sides had been expecting the conflict to escalate to lethal violence. The Atlanta Police Department immediately launched a major investigation into Big Nut's murder. This wasn't just another street killing to them. Big Nut was a significant figure whose death would have major implications for the city's ongoing gang violence. The investigation would eventually involve multiple law enforcement agencies and become one of the most significant cases in Atlanta's recent history. From the beginning, investigators focused on the connection between Big Nut's murder and the ongoing conflict between YSL and YFN. They began building a case that would eventually encompass years of alleged criminal activity and involve some of the biggest names in Atlanta hip-hop. The investigation was complicated by the code of silence that governed street culture. Witnesses were reluctant to cooperate with police, and those who might have information were afraid of retaliation. This made it difficult for investigators to gather the evidence they needed to build a strong case. However, investigators had several advantages in this case. The high-profile nature of the victim meant that resources would be allocated to solve the case. Additionally, the ongoing conflict between YSL and YFN had been generating intelligence for months, giving investigators a foundation to build upon. The investigation also benefited from advances in forensic technology and surveillance capabilities. Cell phone records, social media posts, and security camera footage provided investigators with tools that hadn't been available in previous cases. One of the key pieces of evidence in the investigation was a rental car that had been used in the shooting. Investigators were able to trace the rental agreement and identify the person who had rented the vehicle. This paper trail would eventually lead them to Woody and become a crucial element in the prosecution's case. The rental car had been obtained using false identification, but investigators were able to use surveillance footage and other evidence to identify the actual renter. This type of forensic work demonstrated the sophistication of the investigation and the resources being devoted to solving the case. The car itself contained forensic evidence that linked it to the shooting scene. Ballistics evidence, DNA samples, and other physical evidence provided investigators with concrete proof that this vehicle had been used in the crime. The rental car connection also provided investigators with a timeline of events leading up to the shooting. They were able to track the vehicle's movements and identify other locations where the conspirators had met to plan the attack. This evidence would later become central to the prosecution's case against Young Thug and other YSL members. The rental car provided a direct link between the shooting and the alleged conspiracy to commit murder. In the months following Big Nut's murder, Woody found himself under intense scrutiny from law enforcement. He was arrested multiple times on various charges, but the most significant arrest came in April 2015 when he was caught with a Diamondback .223 assault rifle at a community center. This wasn't just a simple weapons charge, this was a federal case that could put him away for years. The circumstances of Woody's arrest were significant. He had brought the assault rifle to a community center in a shopping bag, where he left it on the bleachers while playing basketball. A concerned citizen noticed the bag and called police, who discovered the weapon and traced it back to Woody through surveillance footage. The rifle had been purchased by Quindarius Zachary, also known as YSL member Lil D, which directly connected Woody's case to the broader YSL investigation. This purchase created a paper trail that law enforcement could follow, and it provided them with leverage to pressure Woody into cooperation. The federal nature of the charges was crucial because it meant that Woody was facing serious prison time under federal sentencing guidelines. Federal weapons charges carry mandatory minimum sentences, and Woody's criminal history made him eligible for enhanced penalties that could have resulted in decades in prison. The timing of the arrest was also significant. Coming just months after Big Nut's murder, it provided law enforcement with an opportunity to pressure Woody for information about the killing and the broader conflict between YSL and YFN. When Woody was arrested, he was immediately brought in for questioning. The interrogation footage from this period, which would later be leaked during the YSL trial, shows a man who was clearly trying to save himself by any means necessary. Woody began providing information about various crimes, shootings, and the internal workings of YSL. The interrogation revealed the sophisticated approach that federal investigators were taking to the case. Rather than simply focusing on the weapons charge, they were using Woody's arrest as an opportunity to gather intelligence about a much broader criminal conspiracy. Woody's willingness to talk surprised even experienced investigators. Most street criminals, especially those with Woody's reputation, are reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement. However, Woody seemed eager to provide information, perhaps because he understood the serious nature of the charges he was facing. But here's the crucial detail that many people miss. Woody later admitted that much of what he told police during these early interrogations was fabricated. He was making up stories, creating fictional characters, and telling investigators whatever he thought they wanted to hear. This wasn't strategic cooperation. This was desperate lying by someone trying to avoid a lengthy federal sentence. The fabricated information created problems for investigators who had to spend time and resources chasing leads that didn't exist. However, it also provided them with insight into Woody's character and his willingness to say anything to save himself. Despite his cooperation attempts, Woody was still convicted on federal weapons charges and sentenced to 5 years in prison. This conviction was significant because it established him as a federal informant while also giving him a criminal record that would affect his credibility as a witness. The sentence was longer than Woody had expected, especially given his cooperation with investigators. This disparity between his expectations and reality created resentment that would influence his future interactions with law enforcement. He served most of his sentence, being released in late 2019. During his incarceration, he had time to reflect on his cooperation and its consequences. The fact that he had provided information to law enforcement but still received a significant sentence made him question the value of cooperation. The federal conviction also marked Woody as a snitch in the street world. Word of his cooperation spread throughout Atlanta's criminal community, making him a target for retaliation and destroying his reputation among his former associates. The conviction created a paradox for Woody. He was now known as both a dangerous street figure and a police informant. This dual reputation would make it difficult for him to navigate either world successfully. Woody's time in federal prison was marked by violence and conflict. Despite his reputation as a cooperator, he was still seen as a dangerous individual by other inmates. He was involved in several fights and was even stabbed during one incident. The stabbing occurred when other inmates tested Woody to see if his cooperation with law enforcement had made him soft. The attack was both a test of his resolve and a punishment for his perceived betrayal of the street code. Woody's response to the stabbing demonstrated that his cooperation with law enforcement hadn't changed his fundamental character. He retaliated against his attackers and maintained his reputation for violence even within the prison system. The prison experience reinforced Woody's belief that he lived in a world where violence was the only currency that mattered. Despite his cooperation with law enforcement, he was still subject to the brutal logic of street justice. His time in prison also gave him an opportunity to network with other criminals and learn about different criminal enterprises. Rather than rehabilitating him, the prison experience may have actually expanded his criminal knowledge and connections. When Woody was released from federal prison in 2019, he attempted to rebuild his life and even tried to launch a rap career. He released songs like First Day Out and put together a mixtape called I Am the Streets. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A known informant was trying to build credibility in a culture that values loyalty above all else. His music videos showed him in helicopters overlooking Atlanta like he was Tony Montana, and he continued to rep YSL in interviews and public appearances. This was either incredible audacity or complete delusion. A man who had cooperated with federal investigators was still trying to maintain his street credibility. The attempt to launch a rap career was complicated by his reputation as a cooperator. While some people were curious about his story, the hip-hop community was largely hostile to his efforts. His cooperation with law enforcement had made him a pariah in a culture that values loyalty above all else. Despite these challenges, Woody persisted in his musical efforts. He believed that his story and his reputation for violence would be enough to overcome the stigma of cooperation. However, his music failed to gain significant traction and his career never took off. The failure of his musical career left Woody in a difficult position. He had burned bridges in the criminal world through his cooperation, but he was unable to establish himself in the legitimate world of hip-hop. This left him in a kind of limbo, belonging fully to neither world. Woody's freedom was short-lived. He was arrested again in 2020 and then again in 2021, this time during a traffic stop where he was allegedly swerving and found with ammunition. These arrests led to more interrogations, more cooperation attempts, and more lies that would eventually come back to haunt him. The 2021 arrest was particularly significant because it occurred during a period when law enforcement was building the RICO case against YSL. Woody's arrest provided investigators with another opportunity to pressure him for information about Young Thug and other YSL members. The 2021 interrogation, which was also leaked during the YSL trial, showed Woody offering to help police with active investigations, suggesting sting operations, and providing detailed information about alleged murder plots. This wasn't just snitching. This was active collaboration with law enforcement against his former associates. The interrogation revealed that Woody was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to avoid prison time. He offered to wear a wire, participate in sting operations, and provide real-time intelligence about criminal activities. This level of cooperation went far beyond typical informant relationships. However, the interrogation also revealed Woody's continued willingness to lie to law enforcement when it suited his purposes. He made claims about murder plots and criminal activities that investigators later determined were fabricated or exaggerated. Adding another layer to the story, Woody's girlfriend at the time was a police officer who was arrested for allegedly trying to help him by accessing evidence and deleting his social media accounts. This incident highlighted just how deep Woody's connections to law enforcement had become and raised questions about the extent of his cooperation. The arrest of his girlfriend demonstrated the personal cost of Woody's choices. His decisions weren't just affecting him, they were destroying the lives of people who cared about him and tried to help him. The police officer lost her job and faced criminal charges for trying to protect Woody. The incident also revealed the extent to which Woody was willing to compromise others to protect himself. He had asked his girlfriend to use her position as a police officer to help him, putting her career and freedom at risk for his benefit. The girlfriend's arrest created additional legal jeopardy for Woody, as prosecutors could potentially charge him with conspiracy or obstruction of justice for his role in the scheme. This added another layer of complexity to his already complicated legal situation. The incident also demonstrated how Woody's cooperation with law enforcement had blurred the lines between his criminal activities and his relationships with legitimate authority figures. His ability to manipulate people in positions of trust made him both valuable and dangerous as an informant. Throughout this period, a clear pattern emerged in Woody's behavior. He was willing to say or do whatever was necessary to avoid consequences for his actions. This pattern included lying to law enforcement, manipulating romantic partners, and betraying former associates. The pattern revealed a fundamental character flaw that made Woody unreliable as both a criminal and an informant. His willingness to betray anyone for personal advantage made him dangerous to everyone around him. Law enforcement agencies began to recognize this pattern and became more cautious about relying on Woody's information. While he was still valuable as a source of intelligence, his credibility was increasingly questioned. The pattern also made Woody vulnerable to manipulation by law enforcement. Investigators learned that they could pressure him into providing information by threatening him with additional charges or longer sentences. And this dynamic created a toxic relationship between Woody and law enforcement, where both sides were using each other for their own purposes without any genuine trust or loyalty. In May 2022, Young Thug and 27 other alleged YSL members were arrested in a massive RICO case that sent shockwaves through the hip-hop world. The indictment alleged that YSL was not just a record label, but a criminal street gang responsible for murders, shootings, drug trafficking, and other violent crimes dating back to 2012. The RICO indictment was the culmination of years of investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies. It represented one of the most ambitious attempts to use federal racketeering laws against a hip-hop organization, and it had implications far beyond the specific defendants charged. Woody wasn't charged in the RICO case, which was significant. Despite being connected to many of the alleged crimes and having admitted to various illegal activities, he was conspicuously absent from the indictment. This absence strongly suggested that he was being protected as a potential witness for the prosecution. The scope of the indictment was unprecedented in hip-hop history. It alleged that YSL was responsible for a wide range of criminal activities over a period of more than a decade. The charges included murder, attempted murder, armed robbery, participation in criminal street gang activity, and conspiracy to violate the RICO Act. The indictment also alleged that Young Thug was the leader of the criminal organization and that he had directed various criminal activities from his position at the top of the hierarchy. This allegation made him the primary target of the prosecution and the defendant facing the most serious potential penalties. As the case developed, it became clear that Woody was going to be the prosecution's star witness. His alleged first-hand knowledge of YSL's operations, his claimed involvement in various crimes, and his previous statements to law enforcement made him crucial to the state's case against Young Thug and the other defendants. The prosecution's strategy relied heavily on Woody's testimony to establish the criminal nature of YSL and Young Thug's role as its leader. Without Woody's testimony, much of their case would have been based on circumstantial evidence and social media posts. However, there was a problem. Woody didn't want to testify. Despite years of cooperation with law enforcement, when it came time to take the stand in open court, he tried to invoke his Fifth Amendment rights and refused to testify. This created a major crisis for the prosecution, who had built much of their case around his expected testimony. Woody's reluctance to testify stemmed from several factors. He was concerned about his safety, worried about further damaging his reputation in the hip-hop community, and uncertain about the benefits of continued cooperation with law enforcement. The prosecution's dependence on Woody's testimony revealed a fundamental weakness in their case. If their star witness was unwilling to cooperate, it called into question the strength of their evidence and their ability to secure convictions. To force Woody to testify, the prosecution granted him immunity, which meant that nothing he said on the stand could be used against him in future prosecutions. This was supposed to remove any legal jeopardy and compel him to tell the truth. But as we would soon learn, immunity can be a double-edged sword. The immunity deal was crucial because it meant that Woody could admit to crimes without fear of prosecution, but it also meant that if he lied under oath, he could potentially be charged with perjury. The prosecution was gambling that Woody would tell the truth and help convict Young Thug and the other defendants. The terms of the immunity agreement were carefully negotiated to protect both Woody and the prosecution's interests. The agreement covered his testimony about specific events and activities but didn't provide blanket protection for all of his criminal activities. The immunity deal also created expectations about Woody's testimony. The prosecution expected him to provide detailed, truthful testimony about YSL's criminal activities and Young Thug's role as the organization's leader. However, the immunity deal didn't account for Woody's unpredictable personality and his willingness to sabotage the prosecution's case. The prosecution assumed that immunity would make Woody a cooperative witness, but they underestimated his capacity for chaos. Before Woody took the stand, there was extensive legal maneuvering about the scope of his testimony and the conditions under which he would testify. Defense attorneys argued that his previous statements to law enforcement were unreliable and that his testimony should be limited. The prosecution fought to have Woody's previous statements admitted as evidence, arguing that they were reliable and corroborated by other evidence. This legal battle revealed the central importance of Woody's testimony to the prosecution's case. Defense attorneys also raised questions about Woody's mental health and his capacity to provide reliable testimony. They pointed to his history of brain injury and his pattern of making false statements to law enforcement. The pretrial proceedings also revealed the extent of Woody's cooperation with law enforcement over the years. Court documents showed that he had provided information in multiple investigations and had been in contact with law enforcement agencies for nearly a decade. These revelations damaged Woody's credibility even before he took the stand and provided defense attorneys with ammunition to attack his reliability as a witness. When Woody finally took the stand in June 2024, he immediately became what lawyers call a hostile witness. Instead of helping the prosecution, he began undermining their case from the moment he opened his mouth. He claimed he couldn't see properly, fired his lawyer in the middle of testimony, and repeatedly stated that he had lied to police in all his previous statements. This wasn't just uncooperative behavior. This was active sabotage of the prosecution's case. Woody seemed to take pleasure in frustrating the prosecutors and making them look foolish in front of the jury. His antics included everything from claiming memory problems to making sarcastic comments that had Young Thug laughing in the courtroom. The transformation from cooperative informant to hostile witness was dramatic and unexpected. Prosecutors had spent years cultivating Woody as a witness, and his sudden turn against them caught them completely off guard. Woody's behavior on the stand revealed his true character. He was someone who would say or do whatever served his immediate interests, regardless of previous agreements or commitments. This unpredictability made him both valuable and dangerous as a witness. The hostile nature of his testimony also revealed the fundamental weakness of the prosecution's case. If their star witness was actively working against them, it suggested that their case was built on a foundation of sand. But here's where things get really interesting from a legal perspective. While Woody was busy undermining the prosecution's case, he was also making admissions that could potentially be used against him later. He admitted to lying to federal investigators, acknowledged his involvement in various violent incidents, and essentially confessed to crimes that weren't covered by his immunity agreement. Under cross-examination by Young Thug's lawyer Brian Steele, Woody admitted that he had never actually committed any crimes for Young Thug, that he had made up stories about fictional people during police interrogations, and that much of what he had told investigators over the years was fabricated. These admissions were devastating to the prosecution's case, but potentially incriminating for Woody himself. The admissions revealed the extent to which Woody had been lying to law enforcement throughout his cooperation. He admitted to creating fictional characters, fabricating crimes, and providing false information about criminal activities. These admissions also revealed Woody's sophisticated understanding of the legal system. He knew exactly what to say to undermine the prosecution's case while protecting himself from additional charges. However, the admissions also created new legal jeopardy for Woody. By admitting to lying to federal investigators, he potentially exposed himself to charges of making false statements to federal agents. Here's the legal trap that Woody may have walked into. While he had immunity for his testimony, that immunity was based on the assumption that he would tell the truth. If prosecutors can prove that he committed perjury, that he lied under oath, they could potentially charge him with that crime, which wouldn't be covered by his immunity agreement. Moreover, his admissions to lying to federal investigators in previous interviews could potentially be used to charge him with making false statements to federal agents, another crime that might not be covered by his immunity deal. Woody may have thought he was being clever by undermining the prosecution's case, but he may have actually created new legal jeopardy for himself. The perjury trap is a common prosecutorial tool used to pressure witnesses who are reluctant to cooperate. By granting immunity and then charging perjury if the witness lies, prosecutors can effectively force witnesses to tell the truth or face additional criminal charges. In Woody's case, the perjury trap was particularly dangerous because of his history of making false statements. Prosecutors could potentially argue that any inconsistencies in his testimony constituted perjury, even if those inconsistencies were minor. The trap was also dangerous because Woody's immunity agreement was carefully worded to cover only specific testimony about specific events. Any lies outside the scope of that agreement could potentially be prosecuted. Woody's testimony created unprecedented courtroom drama that captivated the public and dominated social media. His confrontational exchanges with prosecutors, his sarcastic responses to questions, and his obvious disdain for the proceedings made him a viral sensation. The drama reached its peak when Woody fired his lawyer in the middle of his testimony, claiming that she was not adequately representing his interests. This move shocked everyone in the courtroom and created additional legal complications. Woody's behavior also created tension between the judge and the attorneys. The judge struggled to maintain control of the proceedings, while attorneys on both sides tried to manage the chaos that Woody was creating. The courtroom drama also revealed the entertainment value of Woody's testimony. Despite the serious nature of the charges, his antics turned the trial into a form of public entertainment that attracted viewers from around the world. The viral nature of his testimony also created additional pressure on all parties involved. The trial was no longer just a legal proceeding. It had become a public spectacle with implications far beyond the courtroom. Partly due to Woody's disastrous testimony and the overall weakness of the prosecution's case, Young Thug was eventually able to negotiate a plea deal that resulted in his immediate release. He pleaded guilty to some charges but received a sentence of time served plus probation, allowing him to walk out of the courthouse a free man. This outcome was seen as a major victory for Young Thug and a devastating defeat for the prosecution. After spending millions of dollars and nearly 2 years on the longest criminal trial in Georgia history, the state had essentially nothing to show for it. Young Thug was free, and most of the other defendants had also received relatively light sentences. The plea deal was particularly significant because it validated the defense strategy of attacking the prosecution's case rather than simply denying the charges. By exposing the weaknesses in the prosecution's evidence and the unreliability of their star witness, the defense was able to force a favorable resolution. The outcome also demonstrated the risks of building a case around a single witness, especially one with Woody's history of unreliability. The prosecution's dependence on Woody's testimony made their entire case vulnerable to his unpredictable behavior. Young Thug's release was celebrated throughout the hip-hop community as a victory against prosecutorial overreach and an example of how the justice system can be used to target successful black artists. In a bizarre twist, Woody's performance during the trial made him something of a celebrity. His confrontational testimony, his obvious disdain for the prosecutors, and his role in helping Young Thug go free earned him a following on social media. He began doing paid interviews, appearing on podcasts, and even started his own YouTube channel. This newfound fame was both a blessing and a curse. While it provided him with income and attention, it also kept him in the public eye and reminded everyone, including federal prosecutors, of his role in undermining their case. His celebrity status may have actually increased his legal jeopardy rather than protecting him. The celebrity status also created new opportunities for Woody. He was able to monetize his notoriety through various media appearances and business ventures. However, this success was built on his reputation as someone who had betrayed the prosecution, which could make him a target for future legal action. Woody's celebrity also highlighted the strange nature of modern fame, where notoriety can be just as valuable as traditional accomplishments. His fame was based entirely on his role in a criminal trial, yet it provided him with opportunities that his previous criminal activities never had. The celebrity status also created expectations about Woody's future behavior. Fans and critics alike were watching to see what he would do next and whether he could maintain his newfound success. From the federal government's perspective, the YSL trial was an unmitigated disaster. They had spent years building a case, invested millions of dollars in the prosecution, and had their star witness make them look incompetent on national television. This kind of public embarrassment doesn't sit well with federal prosecutors, who are used to winning cases and maintaining their reputation for competence. The fact that Woody had essentially played them, cooperating when it benefited him, lying when it suited his purposes, and then undermining their case when he no longer needed their protection, was particularly galling. Federal prosecutors don't like being made to look foolish, and they have long memories when it comes to people who cross them. The embarrassment was compounded by the high-profile nature of the case. The YSL trial had attracted national attention, and the prosecution's failure was witnessed by millions of people. This public failure damaged the reputation of the prosecutors involved and the agencies they represented. The failure also raised questions about the prosecution's strategy and their reliance on unreliable witnesses. Critics argued that the prosecution had been too eager to build a case and had ignored warning signs about Woody's reliability. The embarrassment created pressure within law enforcement agencies to find a way to salvage their reputation and demonstrate that there are consequences for undermining federal prosecutions. The failure of the YSL prosecution had ripple effects throughout the criminal justice system. Other prosecutors became more cautious about relying on unreliable witnesses, and defense attorneys gained confidence in challenging prosecutorial overreach. The case also had implications for the hip-hop community, where it was seen as evidence that the justice system targets successful black artists. The prosecution's failure was celebrated as a victory against systemic racism and prosecutorial bias. The case also influenced how law enforcement agencies approach RICO prosecutions against entertainment industry figures. The failure of the YSL case demonstrated the risks of trying to apply traditional organized crime laws to hip-hop organizations. The ripple effects also extended to Woody himself, who found himself in a unique position as someone who had successfully defied federal prosecutors and lived to tell about it. This success made him both a folk hero and a target for future prosecution. According to sources close to the situation, federal prosecutors are currently investigating whether Woody committed perjury during his testimony in the YSL trial. If they can prove that he lied under oath about material facts, they could charge him with perjury, which carries a potential sentence of up to 5 years in federal prison. The challenge for prosecutors is proving that Woody's statements were false and that he knew they were false when he made them. Given that Woody has admitted to lying to police in the past, it might be difficult to establish which of his statements were true and which were false, but federal prosecutors are known for their thoroughness and their ability to build complex cases. The perjury investigation is being conducted by a different team of prosecutors than those who handled the YSL case. This separation is designed to avoid conflicts of interest and ensure that the investigation is conducted objectively. The investigation is also being supported by federal agencies that have extensive resources for building complex cases. These agencies have the ability to analyze thousands of documents, interview hundreds of witnesses, and use sophisticated forensic techniques to build their case. The perjury investigation represents a new phase in Woody's legal troubles. While he may have thought that his immunity deal protected him from prosecution, the perjury charges could expose him to significant prison time. Beyond perjury, Woody could potentially face charges for making false statements to federal agents during his various interrogations over the years. Even though he had cooperation agreements, those agreements typically require truthful cooperation. If prosecutors can prove that he deliberately provided false information during his cooperation, they could argue that he violated those agreements and charge him accordingly. The leaked interrogation videos provide a roadmap for prosecutors to follow. They can compare Woody's various statements over the years, identify inconsistencies, and potentially build a case that he systematically lied to federal investigators while pretending to cooperate. The false statements charges could be particularly damaging because they would cover a longer period of time than the perjury charges. Prosecutors could potentially charge Woody with multiple counts of making false statements, each carrying its own potential sentence. The charges could also be easier to prove than perjury because they don't require prosecutors to prove that Woody knew his statements were false at the time he made them. They only need to prove that the statements were actually false and that they were material to the investigation. The false statements charges also also wouldn't be covered by Woody's immunity agreement, which was specifically limited to his trial testimony. This means that prosecutors would have a free hand in pursuing these charges. Perhaps most seriously, there's speculation that federal prosecutors might try to bring their own RICO case against YSL members, including Woody. While the state case focused on Georgia law, federal RICO charges could encompass interstate activities and might not be subject to the same limitations that affected the state prosecution. If federal prosecutors decide to pursue a RICO case, Woody's previous admissions and his acknowledged involvement in various crimes could make him a prime target. His immunity deal with the state wouldn't protect him from federal charges, and his celebrity status would make him a high-profile defendant that could send a message to other potential cooperators. The federal RICO case could be built on different evidence than the state case, potentially avoiding some of the problems that plague the state prosecution. Federal prosecutors have access to different investigative tools and could potentially build a stronger case. The RICO charges could also carry much more serious penalties than the state charges. Federal RICO convictions can result in sentences of up to 20 years in prison, and Woody's criminal history could make him eligible for enhanced penalties. The possibility of federal RICO charges represents the most serious threat to Woody's freedom. Unlike perjury or false statements charges, RICO charges could result in a life sentence for someone with Woody's criminal history. The federal government's motivation for pursuing Woody goes beyond simple justice. His successful sabotage of the YSL prosecution was seen as an attack on the integrity of the federal justice system, and prosecutors want to send a message that there are consequences for undermining federal cases. The motivation is also personal for some of the prosecutors involved. Being made to look foolish by a witness is a professional humiliation that prosecutors don't forget. The desire for revenge is a powerful motivator in the federal justice system. The prosecution of Woody would also serve as a deterrent to other potential witnesses who might consider sabotaging federal cases. By demonstrating that there are serious consequences for betraying cooperation agreements, prosecutors hope to maintain the integrity of their witness programs. The motivation is also institutional. The failure of the YSL prosecution damaged the reputation of federal law enforcement agencies, and prosecuting Woody would help restore their credibility and demonstrate their competence. Today, Woody continues to live in Atlanta, but his situation is precarious. He's been pulled over by police multiple times in recent months, suggesting that law enforcement continues to monitor his activities closely. His probation officer has reportedly told him that he's making her job difficult and suggested that he should consider leaving Atlanta. The constant police attention isn't just harassment. It's a sign that Woody remains a person of interest in ongoing investigations. Federal prosecutors don't forget about people who embarrass them, and they're known for their patience in building cases against targets they want to prosecute. The police stops have become increasingly frequent and intrusive. Officers are clearly looking for any excuse to arrest Woody or find evidence that could be used against him in future prosecutions. This constant pressure is designed to make his life difficult and potentially force him into making mistakes. Woody's probation status also makes him vulnerable to additional charges. Any violation of his probation terms could result in immediate incarceration, giving prosecutors leverage to pressure him for additional cooperation or information. The suggestion that he should leave Atlanta is significant because it indicates that even his probation officer recognizes the danger he faces by remaining in the city. However, leaving Atlanta would also mean abandoning the celebrity status and business opportunities that have provided him with income. Woody's continued presence on social media and his various interviews and appearances keep him in the public eye, but they also provide prosecutors with potential evidence. Every statement he makes, every interview he gives, and every social media post he creates could potentially be used against him if prosecutors decide to move forward with charges. His decision to maintain a high profile might be providing him with some protection. It's harder to make someone disappear when they're constantly in the public eye, but it's also giving prosecutors more material to work with if they decide to build a case against him. The social media presence also creates opportunities for Woody to make statements that could be used as evidence of perjury or false statements. Prosecutors are likely monitoring his online activity and looking for inconsistencies with his previous statements. The interviews and appearances also provide prosecutors with additional opportunities to identify potential charges. Every time Woody speaks publicly, he risks saying something that could be used against him in court. The high-profile nature of his social media presence also makes it difficult for him to disappear or avoid prosecution. His celebrity status ensures that any legal action against him will be highly publicized. Currently, both Woody and federal prosecutors appear to be playing a waiting game. Woody is trying to build a legitimate career and stay out of trouble, while prosecutors are likely building their case and waiting for the right moment to strike. This kind of cat-and-mouse game can go on for years, but it typically doesn't end well for the mouse. The federal government has virtually unlimited resources and patience when it comes to pursuing cases they consider important. If they've decided that Woody needs to be prosecuted, they'll likely find a way to make it happen regardless of how long it takes. The waiting game also creates psychological pressure on Woody. The constant threat of prosecution makes it difficult for him to plan for the future or make long-term commitments. This uncertainty is itself a form of punishment. Prosecutors are likely using this time to build the strongest possible case against Woody. They're probably reviewing all of his previous statements, interviewing additional witnesses, and gathering evidence that could be used to support various charges. The waiting game also allows prosecutors to see if Woody will make additional mistakes that could strengthen their case. Every public appearance and social media post provides them with more potential evidence. The end game for federal prosecutors is likely to make an example of Woody that will deter other witnesses from sabotaging federal cases. They want to demonstrate that there are serious consequences for betraying cooperation agreements and undermining prosecutions. The prosecution of Woody would also serve to restore the reputation of federal law enforcement agencies that were embarrassed by the YSL trial. A successful prosecution would demonstrate their competence and their ability to hold people accountable for their actions. For Woody, the endgame is likely to be a choice between cooperation and prosecution. Prosecutors may offer him another opportunity to cooperate in exchange for avoiding charges, but this cooperation would likely be much more extensive and binding than his previous agreements. The endgame could also involve Woody fleeing Atlanta or even the country to avoid prosecution. However, this would mean abandoning his celebrity status and the business opportunities that have provided him with income. Ultimately, the endgame will likely be determined by whether federal prosecutors believe they have enough evidence to successfully prosecute Woody, and whether they believe that prosecution serves their broader interests in maintaining the integrity of the federal justice system. The story of Lil Woody is ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to play both sides in the criminal justice system. Woody thought he could cooperate with law enforcement when it benefited him, lie when it suited his purposes, and then undermine their case when he no longer needed their protection. But the federal government doesn't work that way. Federal prosecutors view cooperation as a contract. You provide truthful information and testimony in exchange for leniency and protection. When someone violates that contract, especially in such a public and embarrassing way, there are consequences. Woody may have helped young Thug go free, but he may have sealed his own fate in the process. The irony is that Woody's attempt to have it both ways, to be both a cooperator and a street legend, may have left him with the worst of both worlds. He's lost credibility in the streets because of his cooperation, but he's also lost protection from law enforcement because of his betrayal. He's a man without a country, living on borrowed time. As we've seen throughout this story, the federal government has a long memory and unlimited resources. They don't like being embarrassed, and they don't forget about people who cross them. Woody may think he's won because young Thug is free and he's become a celebrity, but the game isn't over. In fact, it may just be beginning. The feds still want Lil Woody, and when the federal government wants someone, they usually get them. The only question is when, not if. Woody's story serves as a reminder that in the world of federal law enforcement, there are no winners when you try to play both sides. There are only different types of losers. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The next chapter in the Lil Woody saga is still being written, and it might not have the happy ending he's hoping for. The streets don't forgive, and neither do the feds. Woody's about to learn that lesson the hard way.